All right, we're live.
All right.
Hey, PH, what's up? Thanks for showing up. I appreciate it. I am live here with a friend of mine, Blaze Sawyer. He actually recommended the movie Mars Express to me, knowing that I rather enjoy Cyberpunk, and I watched it and loved it. And I think that it has a lot to say about cyberpunk tropes.
Mm-hmm.
It has its own voice and perspective. And so I'm very excited to talk about this. And it's funny because Blaze and I see each other every week on Saturdays because we work together at the toy store. And it's become very difficult to not talk about Mars Express until the stream.
We definitely have talked about it a bit.
Yes, we sure have. So, pardon me, Blaze, you're going to hear things that I've said before.
Same to you, yep.
But I'm super excited to do this. And you are, I would absolutely consider you a film buff, and you are very interested in a film's influences. Mm-hmm. You're interested in the perspective of the director, perspective of the screenwriter.
For sure.
And so I know that you are sort of going to bring that to this conversation, which I'm very excited about. I haven't myself looked into any of the director's interviews or commentary or screenwriter or anything like that. So I'm excited to hear what you have. Also, you prepared a syllabus of influencing films. And so we're coming to this, I wouldn't say I'm completely prepared. There are some films that I definitely was unable to. I just didn't make the time to do it. But we're going to go into, and it's in the description. So, brace for spoilers for Mars Express, but also Ghost in the Shell, Blade Runner, The Long Goodbye, possibly EXISTENZ, possibly not. I kind of threw that in there as like a material influence, but we might not get into that. What's it? Space Adventure Cobra?
Right, which I don't know if either of us got. I didn't have a chance to watch. I
also didn't have a chance to watch that, so probably not that. And then Chinatown.
Yep.
So if you haven't seen any of those films and you don't want to be spoiled, this is your warning. You can certainly step away now, watch all of them, and then come back and watch this.
Yeah, all pretty.
I don't know how reasonable that is, though. But I want to go ahead and start with theme, because that's what I try to do usually in a conversation like this. So I would like to ask you first, and we've already had this conversation sort of, but I want you to sort of present what you think the theme is so that we can link the different scenes and character motivations back to it to see how successful the movie was.
So I think, like a lot of cyberpunk, it touches on themes of humanity pretty heavily. One's sense of self, what makes a human, like, it's kind of a general theme for cyberpunk in general. I think it's one of the binding themes of the genre.
I agree. So I agree with that. So it's going to be humanity and identity, but also cyberpunk is typically defined, at least in part, by this idea of high-tech low life. And I actually think that this film, at least in how long I've thought about it in this moment, I think it nails that theme, but even takes it a step further to high-tech no life. And it's in very specific ways, and it's not all throughout, but I think that it's there, right? I think that it's at least a suggestion, which is interesting, specifically in the way that it does it. Now, and I'm going to just get this out there. When I first watched Mars Express through for the first time, I was taking it in as sort of like, okay, yes, this is a trope I've seen before. Okay, yes, cyberpunk usually deals with this. But as the film progresses and as the story's revealed, you definitely get this unique perspective on what it's trying to say about humanity in the context of a cyberpunk setting.
For sure. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Okay.
I don't think it's shy about using tropes either. I think it's very much like, hey, these are the things that make this genre. We have our own twist on them, but you can't really do this genre without getting comparisons pulled from some of the major works in it.
I completely agree. So yeah, like it's very kind of like, I mean, it's a neon noir style detective
Right.
story, cyborgs, robots, AI, all those sorts of things, like a ruling upper class versus the common class that's usually, you know, below at least the upper class. And so the film starts off with, we're in a dorm room
Mhm.
with a female character who is reading something, but then is interrupted by her cat, who has like smudges or some sort of grease or oil all over it. It's getting it all over the place. And you are immediately made aware that it is not a real cat. It's a mechanical cat. She runs her finger along the back of it. It sort of goes through a process, I'll say.
Yep.
And then you can see the skin sort of sags off of it, and she takes it off and throws it in the hamper because it's cleanable.
Right.
And then the android cat or robot, however you want to call it, gets up and just does cat stuff, but without its fur.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is initially like, she's upside down at first, then she turns right side up, then the cat is, you know, disrobed. And I think all of that together is sort of, it's a really great opening shot with regard to exactly what you're going to experience in the film. Mm-hmm. Like, there is a very, I don't know how to do this without just, you know, blowing the idea or the message or the theme up. So I guess I'm going to just do that. Like, so there is a line in Ghost in the Shell where the puppet master, toward the end of the film, when he's exchanging with Makoto the Major, and they're sort of in a dormant state. They're both cyborgs. They're both sort of shut down, communicating with one another, and they're really the only ones that can hear each other, except for, you know, Bato, but
right. That
doesn't matter. What matters is that the puppet master, who is a purely synthetic life form, he was not originally human. And so, you know, within the context of the film, these cyborgs, these ghosts, come from a sort of downloaded consciousness from a brain into a cybernetic body, which is why the film's called Ghost in the Shell. But the puppet master is a synthetic organism that has sort of developed a ghost or a soul. So it's a completely mechanical, completely programmatic creature that sort of, again, develops the soul, which is, you know, according to the technology of the movie, measurable. And so in that film, toward the end, when he's discussing things with the Major, he says, I call myself, and I think, what's he saying, advanced life form or something like that. But, and I have the script on Drew's Scriptorama up here, which is not the shooting script, so it's not going to be an exact quote, but this is just the script. Yeah, you'll get the idea. You'll get the idea. So the quote is, I'm still incomplete. For some reason, my system lacks the basic life processes of either death or the ability to leave behind offspring. I think he actually says reproduce in the movie. And that is, I think, evident all throughout this film, because human beings all throughout this film are in the process of removing their own ability to die and their own ability to reproduce. So they are actively removing these things that make them, according to the puppet master and Ghost in the Shell, basic life.
For sure. There is a character in this movie that is kind of going on a similar track, although he starts out sentient and is kind of moving towards a similar viewpoint.
Yeah, Carlos, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. And I would view him as like the main character of the film. It's, again, I said off screen that I'd be willing to sort of call it an ensemble kind of a cast, because there's multiple characters who you could consider a protagonist, at least in one part of the film or another. But I think Carlos really draws a through line from start to finish. But to tie this back to the opening scene with the cat, it's already evident in the film that they are removing life. They're like isolating life, right? Because usually a cat's a living creature. You would have an actual living companion with you. but they're removing that aspect and just making it completely mechanical of an android. Now,
I think that's the first really clever thing this movie does. It starts with the cat with the skin on, so first starting watching the movie, you think it's just a regular cat, and it's kind of introduces you into the idea that maybe human life is starting to become replaceable.
Yes.
Or not human life, but life in general is starting to become replaceable by this company.
Yes. I agree. I thought that was clever. It's also, so when, you get a look at the cat's face and it looks heterochromatic, but then I think the eye is broken, and that's what's sort of getting the fluid all over the place. So police show up. They're looking for a particular individual. Turns out they're actually trying to hunt her to kill her. And, the roommate, who we find out is the roommate, gets her neck broken. She's dead. And then we immediately switch scenes to the main characters. Well, Carlos, and also the female lead whose name I can't remember. You have
I believe it is... Aline, something like that.
I think you're
something along those lines. I might have pronunciation wrong.
And so then it sort of breaks down into this sting operation of police employing a robot or an android in Carlos. Attempting to shut down this operation of Roberta Williams to jailbreak robots and sort of give them a free will to sort of free them from the protocols that limit them to life of servitude or service to humans or whatever. So I've been talking for a while.
I mean, you're right on. I think this is kind of the start of some of those themes of finding humanity and identifying with humanity, is the whole introduction to jailbreaking, right? It's the freeing the oppressed in a way, right? Humans have created this society of beings that have the ability to live, but they're kept as product.
Yes, they are kept as product, and it has become a sort of legal issue to jailbreak them, to allow them to live with free will, which is another nod to the theme, right? So in Blade Runner and even ALPHAVILLE, which is a movie that I don't know if I put in the description as, fair game for spoilers, but it is. So in ALPHAVILLE, which is sort of the granddaddy progenitor of the cyberpunk genre, at least I think most people would credit that with, at least I think that Philip K. Dick credits it, and also
I believe Gibson might as well.
So ALPHAVILLE is essentially a detective going to this town, ALPHAVILLE, discovering that it's essentially like an AI that's running everything, and so it's a detective who's hunting an AI, right? Blade Runner is then also.
Humans in ALPHAVILLE, humans are progressively giving more and more of their personalities up to these androids and becoming more and more augmented by them, which is a theme that will run deep through the genre for years. I think that's going to be the main influence that movie has on a lot of it.
Yes, I agree with that. Jean-Luc Godard, I think, is the director. And his story is very interesting. But so then the same thing happens in Blade Runner, right? But there's a little bit of a spin on it, because it's no longer one central AI controlling everything. It's individual AIs. And that, I think, is where it definitively becomes a question of identity. What does it mean to be human? So I think that's where those themes are introduced.
It's also it's the guide to visualization for cyberpunk. I feel like everything you see afterwards is going to be inspired by Blade Runner. I think that's where maybe most of its inspiration on Mars Express comes in, is the visual stylizations of Mars, because it's kind of a stand-in for LA in either Blade Runner or some of those noir films like a Chinatown.
Yep, I completely agree with that. I think Ghost in the Shell also sort of lends that that level of aesthetic to the genre, but Blade Runner is usually the one that's just very intensely called back to, because it was an extremely visual movie, and I think that it has that influence. It has the pedigree.
And nothing like that had been seen up to that point, pretty much. It holds up perfectly visually maybe you can have some complaints about some other elements of that movie here or there, but on a visual level, it's still a flawless movie.
Yes, yeah.
Which is why
Okay,
it resonated so much.
Completely agree. Yeah, Blade Runner is likely one of my favorite movies of all time. I find it difficult to really put those labels on movies, but I think Blade Runner is definitely in the running. So PH says, Alphaville's also noir detective, find it more abstract and philosophical. I agree with that.
For sure. It's very much inspired by French poetry of the time, and you can
Mhm.
tell that watching it because it definitely takes that tone with its dialogue.
And I think you also, Alphaville has a very modern, present sort of presence, because this past Saturday you were telling me about how he set it in what was at the time modern day Paris,
Right.
and it completely flies.
Right. I mean, he
Which,
uses that as his dystopia, and you wouldn't, there's
yeah,
no complaints.
no, there aren't, and I think that while they're, which is kind of funny, right? Because I think if you could set a film in a modern day city in the United States, and not necessarily, let me rephrase this, you can set a cyberpunk film in just the, without any set dressing, the modern day streets of an American city,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that people would be less likely to believe it, because it's, missing the neon,
For
it's
sure.
missing the, but we are kind of sort of living in a cyberpunk dystopia,
Yeah.
because people have access, like they have access to the all of human knowledge in the palm of their hands, a device in the palm of their hands. Some people still can't feed their families.
Right. Yeah. As opposed to giant neon Coke billboards in Blade Runner, we're getting fed advertisements based on what we say we want for dinner. We turn on our
Right.
phones and Instagram's going to have,
Right.
5
And,
advertisements for it you just said.
in a way, it's even worse today, because the the cyberpunk dystopia authors of the 80s and 90s, I don't think could ever have envisioned us becoming the product. So
Yeah.
our information is constantly data mined, and they're turning around and selling it so that they can do things like advertise dinners to us and whatnot, just from
Right.
us speaking it into the air, and our
Yep.
devices are listening to us. I don't think they could have, or I don't know, they could have, they probably could have, but they didn't envision that sort of invasive
Yeah.
consumerism. And so in a lot of ways, it's much more egregious today than it was in the fiction of the 80s and 90s.
Right. Because we're willingly part of it. I mean, we know
Yes.
exactly what's happening, but it's not going to stop, modern day-to-day living.
Yeah, people
We're,
are still
we're
going to
pretty
sign up for
fine with
Facebook.
living in this. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. And so moving from that into Mars Express, is Mars Express takes a very, it's a much more bleak examination of humanity,
Mhm.
right? So usually in a cyberpunk film, humanity is not complicit in their undermining. It's
Right.
usually
There's a
corporations or
circumstance.
consumerism, or
Yep.
whatever the big bad of the particular setting is, which usually amounts to corporatism.
Yep.
In Mars Express, humanity is completely complicit in their undermining. I agree with this, and we'll get there. So PH says Mars Express takes a more personal approach, emphasizing relationships and memories tied to android characters. Completely agree. And that's not, that's with regard to humanity being complicit. I think that Mars Express, on this side of what we were just talking about with regard to us being the product, I think that's what it essentially is taking a look at, right? So
Yeah.
because we are so willing to sign up for Facebook, or to just put our information out there and allow someone to consume it and turn it around and sell it and earn billions and billions of dollars with our permission, or what amounts to our permission.
I think it has the advantage of being the first major piece of cyberpunk fiction, at least that I've come across recently, in this time where AI and this nature of what we're talking about is so prevalent. Like, all these movies are predicting the future. This movie is getting to work with what we're currently, in.
Yes.
And getting to kind of make commentary on that.
I agree with that. And I think that it's sort of, it's kind of a scary shift in the cyberpunk genre, because we're not looking forward toward what can happen if we don't put the brakes on. We're looking back to what has happened because we haven't put the brakes on.
Yep, just with a little bit more, stylization to it, because
yeah, exactly. It's a stylized way of sort of putting this sort of stuff under the microscope. And so let's go ahead and talk about Carlos. So Carlos mirrors Major Makoto's duality. I agree with you, but I think Carlos is a lot more complicated than the Major in Ghost in the Shell.
I mean, he goes through the whole thing of, I guess we're still in the first scene, but he goes through.
We don't have to be at this point.
Okay.
It's like we've kind of already unshackled that.
I mean, he goes through a whole thing where he's like grasping for humanity. Like, he's trying to make it work with his wife, who, there's a line in the movie, they had problems before he died and became an android, right? Like, his problems with humanity started when he was a human, and he's still trying to grasp to it now after his consciousness has been uploaded into the cybernetic body.
Yes.
Which is very interesting.
It is interesting. And specifically with regard to that, on the second viewing, right? So Carlos is an extremely sympathetic character. He's written for audience investment, right?
Yep, for sure.
He's smart. He's capable. Like, the fact that I think the greatest trick, or one of the greatest tricks in the whole movie, so robots have to obey humans. He is a cop, though, right? So how difficult is it to be a cop, or at least a detective? I don't know if he works for any service, but how difficult is it to be a cop and try to hunt down and incarcerate humans when you eventually have to listen to any directive they give about letting them go?
Well, I mean, he even has the prime directive. He can't inflict violence on humans. He can't use language. Like, that's such an interesting thing that's brought up as soon as the first scene, or at least the second scene when they first get introduced. They mention that stuff.
Yes,
immediately.
Yep, so because he says, I'll be jailbroken, I'll be able to commit violence, I'll be able to curse, et cetera, I'll be an outlaw.
His humanity within the first 5 minutes of the movie, and you're seeing the toll it's taking on that character relatively quickly.
Yes, and I actually think that this is it's important. I didn't count scenes. I probably should have counted scenes, but getting back to the trick, one of the funnest tricks in the movie, I think, is when he is pursuing a human perpetrator. He'll grab them and then immediately turn himself off.
So that they do that in the second scene, the first scene he's introduced in. I kind of have a basic layout of the major scenes, at least.
Oh, good.
Yeah, he does that pretty quickly, and I think it's a really interesting look into how he's starting to use some of the more robotic elements to his advantage and let go of some of the more some of his humanity in doing that.
Yes.
It's also the thing that kind of saves him later, even though he eventually makes a choice when all the robots have the takeover happen to them, and he didn't get that last update because his storage is full, which they mention.
But he still chooses to go anyway.
Yep.
Yeah. So, Carlos, very, very interesting character. There's a lot of insights with regard to Carlos. So he is a robot. In the very first scene where he's introduced, which is the second scene of the film, that's 2, not 3. He goes through that rigmarole of, yes, I realize what's happening, I'm going to be an outlaw, but he mentions specifically the things that robots are not allowed to do or not capable of doing. And several times throughout the film, he sort of violates that, at least in part, right?
Yeah.
So he does attempt to commit violence. Whether or not he stops himself or it's his protocol stopping him, it's very ambiguous, right?
Well,
and also he stops himself from cursing several times.
Yep, that's what I was going to say. In the first scene alone, there's like a point where he gets cut off halfway through, like maybe right as the sprinklers are going off to destroy the computer, somewhere around then. But like,
he's goddamn
that you see that
stops.
He's still not used to the limitations that are put on him.
Right, and so going back to the family that you brought up, how he was having trouble with his humanity prior to being a robot. Imagine that situation, right? Like the blonde detective whose name I can't remember. It's Eileen or
something like that. Aline.
Okay,
Aline, I think.
Aline. This also happened with The Last Duel. It's those French names. So Aline, there's a very important scene, and it's a little bit of a throwaway dialogue where they're sort of having a conversation back and forth between, oh, you know, you're dead, and he's like, well, I'm not really dead. He's like, nah, you're dead.
Nah,
And so,
yeah, exactly.
like, consider that for a moment, right? Like, even if there was a backup of my own brain in some computer somewhere that could be uploaded into a robotic body, and I die, it's not me.
No, it's
That robot's
a
not
program
me.
Pretending to be you. It is
Right.
It is a stand-in.
And that's what's happening when he visits his family. It's not like they've not been allowed to grieve because he's not gone. He's constantly trying to remain, you know, in touch with his daughter, and he's
Right.
trying to remain in touch with his ex-wife. And it's just what an awful existence. Like, if you are a robot and that's sort of hard coded into your memory, what an awful way to live, because you're not that person. Those memories are manufactured, and this sort of gets into the whole Ghost in the Shell parallel. Because, like, are you really that person if you just have copies of their memories? If you haven't lived those memories, what makes that different? What makes you, you know?
I mean, even to the point where if his storage wasn't full, he could have been updated to where he could have just been taken out by the robot takeover.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
He is, like, decidedly not human if the corporation can update him and he is one of theirs now.
Right. And it's another good point, because I think it's his inability to update, his memory capacity being full, that makes him even more human.
He gets frustrated because he needs to update, but they won't let him. Like, it's a point in the movie that's very, I mean, it makes the ending hit so much harder because it is a choice.
Yes.
Which is very human.
It is very human. He kind of resigns to the fact that, you know, everything he knows is sort of manufactured for him. It's not something he's actually experienced, aside from his genuine experiences. And he's treated like a thing the entire time. Like, he doesn't get to, on the actual Mars Express, he doesn't get to sit with the people. He has to go strap in below decks with the other robots.
Right. He is in the luggage compartment, essentially.
Exactly. He's the only one that looks even remotely human, but he's also, you know, strapped in there with the rest of those robots. It's a very interesting, jarring juxtaposition.
Yep. That's what he's doing during that scene. I think what they're doing with Aline during that scene is just as interesting. We see her waiting in line for the bathroom, or she's doing push-ups at one thing. She's doing all these very human things while he is stuck being this product. It's a very interesting juxtaposition between the two of them.
Yeah, it is. It is. So, with regard to, well, what are there any quotes, any relevant quotes from the director about, like, Carlos or any of those things, or what?
So, based on some reading I was doing, and this is getting into a little bit of the influence of the noir movie, he was trying to make a movie like a Chinatown or The Long Goodbye type of deal, the grizzled detective that's trying to solve the convoluted mystery. And it was just supposed to be that Aline character, because he wanted to switch it from the general setup of the male detective, try it with the female detective. When you have the female detective, he didn't see the need for a femme fatale character, and that's where the Carlos character gets written into the script. He wasn't initially part of it, which is so interesting because the story very much seems to revolve around him.
Yeah.
Like, it's just so fascinating that character was almost an afterthought. And, you know, stories evolve as you write them. But, like, I don't know what this movie looks like without him.
I agree. It's a drastically different movie. Because, like, even when they capture Roberto, he is able to provide such an incredibly a heightened degree of visual storytelling. So he's sort of, when they capture Roberta Williams after a little bit of a chase, put handcuffs on her, say they're going to take her home to Martha.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
That chase scene, it's so good. Just to start off, the action filmmaking is so good, especially for an animated movie. Like, a lot of times they kind of struggle with set pieces or action placement, stuff like that. But it tells you almost everything you need to know about this world from the start during that chasing. Like, they're running and you look down as the building and you see people protesting for robot rights or against robot rights. Like, it's such efficient storytelling. Just
I completely agree.
Ground, like, they hit the ground running and they let you know everything you need to know about the world almost immediately. Sorry, didn't mean to disrupt.
No, it's okay. It's okay. You don't have to apologize for interrupting me. So then we they acquire her, and some of the next or is it the next scene? They say we're going to take you home.
Yep.
And then they kind of go to this plane to be able to get on the space vessel that's going to take them to Mars.
Yep.
Home being Mars. The name of the vessel is the Mars Express, which is where I guess the name of the movie comes from. But as they're waiting to board,
the movie.
yeah, as they're waiting to board, there is Roberta on the right, who is very much pro jailbreak. So that's what they've arrested her for, because she's constantly jailbreaking robots. Then there's Aline, who's on the left, who is the she's essentially she's the anti jailbreak force, at least in this scene.
She's the establishment in this
this
point in the film.
And then Carlos comes and sits directly between them with a plant in his hands. And the way that he's framed as caught between these two worlds, it's presenting to you the duality of Carlos, and how it's Carlos the robot's duality, but it's also he's presenting himself as a biological organism.
For sure.
That's still how he thinks of himself.
Yeah. I mean, you almost get the idea he's ashamed just from the way he seems to be covering up his face, just waiting for it to leave, even though, again, he's decidedly a product because he has to wait in the luggage compartment.
Yes. Yeah. And then, later on, just to follow this thread through to its end, they arrive on Mars. And this is after we go through him being treated like luggage or like a thing. He's able to offload, gets a little free time, and he goes to his family, which is where we first are introduced to his family. And so now we are on his side. He's a character. To the audience, he is very human. And so we've sort of invested in him emotionally. And it becomes a very sad thing to see his family reject him. He has a daughter that he wants to see and an ex-wife who is remarried. And the perspective isn't immediately apparent, at least it wasn't to me, that this isn't Carlos. This isn't that man. That man is dead. But because we're so emotionally invested, it's Carlos' own emotional investment in his belief in the manufactured, backup memories of the human that he used to be, which makes him human, funny enough. And then, the husband gets home and there's a bit of telegraphed violence that happens. And so, Carlos attempts to punch him. He's sort of prevented from doing so. Whether or not it's self-restraint or programming, pretty ambiguous. I don't think that we know for sure one way or the other, especially because he's prevented himself from cursing the entire film up to this point. So it could be that he's kind of he's already jailbroken and he's just doing the correct things to not be discovered. But then the husband hucks the plant out at him because it was being delivered as a gift to his ex-wife and his daughter. And that, in and of itself is a very, it's very telling, right? So it's how humanity is treating life. It's how, he is thinking of himself as a biological human being, but isn't. And so that idea is kind of shattered after this meeting. And that's kind of when he begins to retreat in the film. So what did I miss? Do you have any additional insights into the Carlos character?
I think
you can go further than this too. You can go all the way up through the end because there's so much more to him.
I think you're hitting it pretty well so far. I just wanted to bring up I read an interview with the director where he was talking about the animation itself and how it pertains to Carlos specifically thematically. So the movie is a blend of 2D and 3D animation, right? He wanted it to be the humans are 2D, humans made by humans, and all the robots you're going to see are going to be 3D. And Carlos, for the most part, is animated based on his perception of self. So for a large majority of the movie, he's drawn in 2D. And as you get further and further into the movie, you'll notice he has a little bit of more 3D animation, at least as far as the robotic body goes, especially towards the end of the movie when he starts becoming more and more skeletal almost.
Okay.
And it's just, I think that they really thought through the whole Carlos thing. I think it's just such a well-written character. Right from the first meetup of the family, you're like, you feel for the guy, you want him to do well, but you also know maybe a lot of the problems he had when he was still alive were on him. Like, he seemed very involved with work. He seems to be more the perceptive, analytical one as far as their duo goes with him and Aline, which is kind of funny just because he's maybe, if that's how he was before he died, he's already a bit more computer-like in the way he analyzes things.
Yeah, and you know, this also I think goes back to another line that we can draw from Ghost in the Shell, and it's another one of the things that the puppet master says in that same scene to the Major is that what is it? You're something along the lines about your desire to remain unchanged is what limits you.
Yes.
And that
Such
is
a fantastic
very
line.
much the case with Carlos. It is very much and it's not necessarily his fault. He's been given these memories that are not his, that he is beholden to.
Right. He's trying to fit the mold of himself. Like,
Yes.
he knows what he's supposed to be, and he is grasping those straws of the last pieces of his humanity.
Yes. And you know, that I think sort of it ends up pushing him toward the decision that he makes at the end, because of how the robots view him versus how the humans view him. His very first contact, like real contact with a robot, is Lem, I think, in Roberta Williams's apartment, right? When Lem tries to come onto him. Then, go ahead. No, you first.
So there's a scene a bit before that where they're in the club looking for June, I think her name is, the one that did the hacking, and they go, "Do you have any humans working here?" And they go, "Well, we're completely synthetic, but we completely see ourselves as human. Isn't that right?" And he looks right at Carlos in that scene. It's like, oh, so you're acknowledging him as this weird hybrid. Like, he is a robot, but you consider yourself human. Like, they really hit on it, like, around that scene too.
Also addresses him with an honorific, sir, which is respectful, unlike the way that we've seen him treated for the entire beginning of the film. And that's another thing with regard to reproduction in the film. All of the humans, or I won't say all the humans, but I think every time sex or reproduction is brought up in the film, humans are always like repulsed at the idea of performing with other humans.
Yeah.
So there's the detective who's investigating the June body double case. He is being made fun of for essentially flirting with the main character. Then there is the strip club scene. Where all of them are synthetic. There is June's teacher who, in some offhanded comment is like, "I can't handle real women anymore. I'd rather do it with a synthetic. I don't have to worry about questions."
When she starts to give him lip is the line. Yes.
Exactly. And so the whole movie, they're establishing this denial of reproduction and also this denial of mortality, because you could just be backed up.
Which is interesting because I think there's a scene, so right around the point in the plot where we are back to, so after they get to Mars, they go to the school to talk to the parents, and they start getting into the idea of the organic AI life forms. Like, that's right around, it's right around this point, fourth, fifth scene maybe, that they start getting in to this idea, which is the upgrade to the current robots.
Yes, which is essentially creating bodies without souls. They've already created souls without bodies because the backups, you can put that in any body you want and it'll still be that, that same person with the same manufactured memories. And so, humans are effectively, actively defeating what it is that, completes them as sentient, biological humans, at least according to the puppet master from Ghost in the Shell. Which I find absolutely fascinating. And it's this perspective that I think it's at the heart of the message in the movie. And I think that it's a very unique take on humanity and AI and cyber. Like, even in today's climate, right? We have AI. There are programs that can do art. We have programs that can make movies. We have programs that, I say programs, they're, large language models and the like, that you can ask for something and pull a book out of it, or pull a screenplay out of it, or some of them actually do actual video or actual music or actual drawings, and you can tell it the style that you want to do it in and everything, and this has caused an uproar in creative communities over whether or not it's ethical, whether or not it's stealing, because these AI have to be trained on external input. So if you're training it on an artist's work that you didn't get or you didn't pay licensing for, then is that theft? And so it is the argument is only humans can create. And so we are now actively arguing against the AIs, which is not real AI, right? They're not real AI.
No.
Yeah, this is true. You can ask it for calculations and get the wrong answers. You can ask it for test scripts and get the wrong steps. But
you can also do that. Professionals, and you can also do that with professionals in any field in real life too. Like humans can, I mean, human error, right?
Yes, exactly. But we're sort of entering this weird territory of, humans arguing against these bots. Essentially, they're not actual intelligences.
Yep.
But humans arguing against these bots being able to creatively express themselves.
Right.
Right. Which is a very strange sort of like, removing yourself from the whole equation, regardless of where you fall. So remove yourself from that and look at it from a 10,000 foot view. It's a very strange thing for humans to actually actively be engaged in. It was Frank Herbert wrote about it in Dune, right? So this goes back a very long time with regard to the capabilities of AI to create versus a human's ability to create.
Right.
What matters in creation? Is it experiential? Is it all just copying things? And so I think that I have no idea why I started down this path or where I'm even going with it.
I actually think it's interesting in relation to this movie because all AI can do is recreate, correct? It's pulling from sources. No matter what, it's going to be a weird amalgamation of other people's art to make this. This movie, this director is also very much pulling from so many different sources, and it's a weird amalgamation, but it has a very personal touch, which I don't think AI is capable of giving. So I think it almost does tie into this movie, what you're saying.
Okay.
Just because this director is, he's not shy about, he pulled from so many different sources, just like, AI might to recreate a picture of, if you look up Deckard, in the world of Ghost in a Shell, it's going to pull all these different images. He pulled all these different images while adding his own personal touch with it, which AI is incapable of.
Yeah.
So I think it almost thematically ties together in the fact that everything's going to be a recreation, much like Carlos is in this movie. He is a recreation of a human trying to fill in the blanks.
Yes. And it's, why was he created as a backup?
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't for Carlos's sake. He's dead. It was for the survivors' sake.
Yeah.
And so now it's just a very complex message. It's a very complex view to sort of try and explain. But I've gone on for nearly an hour now. What are some of the parts of the film that you'd like to touch on, or some of the, influences or themes or whatever? I feel like
I'm cool just running for a little bit longer. So
okay,
around the point where out at the movie is the scene where they go to the club to find June and they start dealing with this. The augmenteds attack is what they call them, which I think is very interesting because you have people like Carlos who are trying to be more human, and you have these augmented, which, if I understand correctly, I don't think they ever explicitly say, are humans that are getting these cybernetic implants and are actively trying to be more computer-like. So I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition of character. And I think that scene, again, is just going into what I was talking about earlier, where it's just really, really good action filmmaking on an animated level. It's very Terminator 2-esque in that it feels like the T-1000 was a direct inspiration for the way they move and run. Like,
Oh yes, for sure.
that scene in general, I just find really, really great. What's your thoughts on that scene?
No, I completely agree. I think that the Terminator, especially the T-1000, occurred to me like there's a chase scene where they're in a car,
Yep.
and the T-1000, it's an augmented human, is running down the street with bladed arms trying to catch them. Right. Now it ends differently. That scene ends differently.
Yep, for sure.
But it was very, very similar. Just the emotionless, inexorable drive
Yep.
of the essentially, robot. It was a human who was analogous to a robot, at least in demeanor, running forward, trying to get the mission completed.
It's also a very interesting look at Carlos and, again, I keep forgetting her name. I keep going back to my notes to find it. The female private investigator character.
Yes.
It's them interacting with the world, which the director has some interesting quotes on the scene specifically being some of the stuff that Chinatown and The Long Goodbye influences. He talks a lot about these 70s private investigator movies. They interact with both the highest of, the high life, and they're down in the slums, which at this point in the movie, they've interacted with both Roy Jack and the club, to go find June. So it's very much along the lines of a Jack Nicholson in Chinatown, where he is going to talk to the person that pretended to be the wife of the character, and he's going to this club, and it very much feels in line with that kind of filmmaking. That's where a lot of those influences come in, I feel.
I agree with that for sure. What else? Where to go from here? Is there anything that you have with regard to why Chinatown? Why noir? With regard to this examination that he's conducting of humanity.
So from one of the interviews I read, it's as simple as he was looking at what kind of movies we have a gap in the market right now. And a lot of those movies that he liked were Chinatown and The Long Goodbye. He had a quote about that where it's just there's a need in the market for this kind of movie right now. There's not a ton of them out there, and it happens to fit really well with Cyberpunk, right? Blade Runner is very Chinatown noir driven, and so is Ghost in the Shell in some ways. It's a pretty common linking of genres. Cyberpunk almost is just the link between sci-fi and noir at this point, I feel, at least in a lot of cases.
That makes sense. It's also a very simple answer. There's no real deep driving essence.
Right. He wanted to make a sci-fi movie, and he wanted to make a private investigator movie akin to some of those other ones that we've mentioned. There's a neat connection that I didn't really quite make the first time watching, but after I rewatched Chinatown, I started noticing both the setups with relative characters have to do with people pretending to be a relative. You have the lady that pretends to be the wife of the guy that works for the water company in Chinatown, and you have the augmented pretending to be her dad in this movie, which is a fun link that I didn't catch before rewatching.
Oh yeah, I didn't catch that either.
Yeah, but it definitely feels in line with it, and almost feels like a direct influence.
I feel like there's quite a bit of that in this movie. Just there's a lot of blocking that is just it's lifted out of the one movie and put in this one.
Sure.
It's a great effect. That's not a criticism. I think that it's wonderfully effectively used.
And I think it also, like you're saying, some shots directly lifted. Mars is such an interesting stand-in, especially for 30s LA, which is when Chinatown takes place. 30s or 40s, I can't remember exactly, but it's when LA is still being built. So it's this unfinished establishment, which Mars kind of is. You have all these interlinking highways and roads and stuff, but it also looks somewhat empty still. There's definitely going to be further work on it, and a
lot of the towers I think are incomplete, aren't they? Or am I misremembering?
I think you're right. At least some of them are. I think there's a couple shots where you're going to see some incomplete construction.
And also the sky dome. It's not a real sky, right? It's just a projection screen.
Right, because it glitches towards the last scene and turns to night pretty immediately.
Yeah, which is neat because night is usually a visual storytelling element to sort of communicate concealment and stealth. But in this one, it's the removal of the artificial. So this is actually what's happening. This is really what's going on. And the blinders have been pulled from the main character's eyes because they know what's actually happening now, which is interesting.
It's also the influence of Blade Runner and Ghost in the Shell are interesting too, just because the director has a quote saying, well, I have it in here. 1 second.
Mhm.
He said, "I don't like Blade Runner, but I really like Akira, and my co-writer is quite the contrary. He is obsessed with Blade Runner and is not a fan of Akira." So it's really the almost clashing takes, I think, really helps flesh out this world a bit, since they're both coming at it from their own perspective of which one is more influential to them. So you do get that kind of clashing of styles, more so than if they both were like, yeah, these are the two best movies ever, and we're gonna put this, this, and this from each one in it. I like that it's kind of a give and take, it feels like, in some scenes.
I agree. I was unaware of that relationship, or those influences.
Mm-hmm.
But Akira should probably definitely be on the list here, right?
Or sorry, did I say Akira in the quote?
Yeah.
I meant Ghost in the Shell. Sorry, that is my
Oh
bad.
no, that's okay.
That is my bad. Although Akira, the body
Yeah,
horror very much feels influenced by
absolutely.
some of the Akira stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I put EXISTENZ in the description, because I think that, materially, not with regard to theming or anything like that. I think materially, with the biological electronic device, or the biological, I don't even know what to call it, right? But
The organics, I think, is what they call it.
yeah, it's organics, and it's very body horror, right?
Yeah.
So they can think, they can speak, they're intelligent, but they're just these amorphous blobs.
Yep.
That are just absolutely horrifying.
Which we learned
And-
Roy Jacker is using them to replace the old guard as far as the robots go, even
Right.
his personal assistant's Beryl, which I feel like we should mention just because that character does become so essential to the plot later on.
Yeah, well, that character ends up being the one who sort of is the grand orchestrator.
Right. They are leading the charge at the end.
Yeah, well, not only Beryl leading the charge at the end, but there is some dialogue prior to that leads you to believe that, or at least it led me to believe that Beryl was the one who kind of convinced Roy Jacker to eliminate all of the robotics, and she was the one that sort of, I say she, it's really it's
It's a bunch of polygons.
Yeah, it's a bunch of polygons put together. It speaks with what you would typically assume as a female voice, but that doesn't matter. They can change their voices, as we saw with Lem.
Mm-hmm.
So Beryl, I'll just say it because that's what it is, which is, in the context of the film, maybe not appropriate. I don't know.
Right.
But it's just one of those things. So Beryl I think Beryl was the one who organized the pitch to whatever the governing body was. It seemed like it was a bunch of world leaders, right?
Yep.
And Beryl was the one who said, "Oh, we need to get rid of the robots," because for whatever reason it gave. And that's why toward the end, Beryl was very well aware of what was happening.
Yep.
And it's sort of like, it started off as, it's an update. It's going to liberate all of them, and they're all going to, fly away and get rid of them. And we are initially under the impression that that's Roy Jacker's doing, because he wants to eliminate the robots so that the organics can step in and fill those roles. But it ends up being Beryl's original idea, because Beryl wanted robots to sort of leave humanity and have their own society.
Existence.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is interesting, just because it is a place of mutual benefit, because, as Aileen does say, well, all the robots are gone, and then you're the one making the profit on the replacements. So it is really interesting, just because I think there's some conversation to be said about how much sentience Beryl has as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
I believe Beryl thinks they're liberating all the robots. Where do you get into this, though? Do you think that's what's happening at the end? Do you think it is just the destruction? It just leads to destruction? How do you read some of that?
The end?
Yeah, I guess we can circle back to it. There's probably some more you want to say about some later stuff.
No, it's okay.
Now,
when you say the end and it's destructive, right? Are we talking about them boarding the Mars Express to sort of go into the stars?
Yeah.
Okay. So I drew an analog between, or not an analog, wrong word, connection between Ghost in the Shell and this particular portion of the film. Because in Ghost in the Shell, there's this idea of water, ascending in water, and that sort of representing birth, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Major's body is constructed underwater, probably to keep it cool, and then it ascends up from the water as it's being born.
Yep.
Makoto likes to deep sea dive, and
Right.
so
Yeah.
there's that
Yep.
scene where she's approaching her reflection on the underside of the surface of the water, then breaks the surface of the water, and she says in the conversation following that sometimes she feels like she's emerging as something completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this idea of ascension and birth with the water. Now, there's no water element here in Mars Express, but I drew a comparison between that idea, the ascension and birth, with their ascension at the end of because they're all, they all shoot their consciousness up into the ships,
Yep.
which are then loaded. And so there's also the ending with, the starburst with all of the different points of light and
Yep.
entirely unexplained.
Right.
The way the camera zooms into it, like as Carlos releases his consciousness, the camera almost kind of follows his beam of light up into the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can read that any way you want to, right? The way that I read it was that it was sort of this giant joining of consciousnesses,
right, collective
consciousness. And you can see Beryl in there. Like Beryl appears in the center of the screen before there's the large
of this whole thing.
Right. So, ultimately, is it destructive? Ultimately, do they find what they're looking for? I don't know. I don't think it's important. Much like the ending of the Green Knight, it's like it doesn't matter what happens after his encounter with the Green Knight. What matters is that he's ready.
Right. I just think it's so interesting because there's a point, after he goes and visits his family one last time, he's doing that last-ditch effort to grasp onto humanity. He's trying anything he can to find some reason to stick around, it seems. And he sees how the world views him, kind of. He starts talking to the robots. He's like, well, you're just leading to your destruction. And you hear what some of the robots are saying, their inner dialogue, like, is that true? He must be lying. You just have to have faith. Like, it's a leap of faith. You don't know what happens after this, which I guess is very interesting. It's getting into some different themes, I guess.
Yeah.
But, like, it just it's so interesting because that's maybe the most human aspect these robots have shown so far, is that they're just doing a leap of faith into this great beyond or whatever.
That's a really good point.
Sharing his emotions. Like, you see a robot shed a tear in that scene, which is the most on the nose imagery maybe you've seen in the movie, but it really gets the point across that they are kind of becoming this collective thing right before they shoot off into this known thing. And I think it's almost a litmus test of who you are, how you view the ending. Like, is it happy? Is it there? Because the first time I watched it, I read it as a destructive element, almost like, oh, the corporation might have won. But I also, the second time I watched it, I was like, okay, well, this can be viewed many different ways.
And
it's just Roy Jacker had. Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Roy Jacker has that line where he says it was Beryl's idea, and she can trick all the robots into thinking that they're going to be going into this, or she can brainwash all these robots into thinking they're going somewhere. Which, again, that could just be Beryl, saying what it needs to say to him to get to this point, because they have their own goal. Or it could be that Beryl's limited in their program, right? I mean, they've already replaced Beryl within the company.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's just doing what the company wants. I think it can be read many different ways, and I might be completely wrong. I might be
I agree. I think there's ambiguity here, and I think that it's sort of I like this sort of ambiguity in a film because it gives us an opportunity to speculate and to break it down. It could be that Beryl is entirely mistaken.
Yeah.
Right. It could be that they are going to launch themselves in, they're going to combine consciousness. It's going to be, and she says, I've picked a good star for us.
Yeah. Because
after saying that we don't need, what do they need? They only need
think she says like energy and
matter and
matter.
energy, or they only need matter and energy, which is like, well, and then she says, I've picked a great star for us, which is like, well, that's what human beings would look for if they were going to launch themselves into a world that they could colonize. But like, stars are literally matter and energy. So is Beryl planning on just launching them all into the middle of a star and destroying them all? Like,
Right.
it's a very ambiguous, there is equal despair and hope. And I think that, that the human element is to hope, right? So even if that's what ultimately happens, that they're launched into a star and completely vaporized, their hope and their faith that makes them bored, especially Carlos, because this isn't programming. He's making a decision to do this.
Yep.
That's what is important here. It very frequently in movies, it doesn't matter what happens after. Everyone has that question. Everyone wants to know, well, what actually happens? That's not what matters. What matters is that Carlos had hope. He began to live as an individual free of his past memories, right? Because everything was gone to him anyway, right? So
especially at that point, he, at this point in the movie, he's jailbroken. Like that kind of happens.
Yeah.
An hour in, right as they reintroduce the hacker character from the beginning of the movie.
Yep. Yeah,
like
and the hacker character
nothing.
just sort of stands there and watches.
Yeah.
As they launch into space.
Yep, their robot companion is shot at this point. I believe it's been taken out by whatever the military unit is that's there currently, and they're just kind of defeated. They're just left watching the results of what's happening with the revolt, which it's very interesting that the revolt is completely non-violent with the androids. It's the humans that are freaking out and causing chaos. Like, it's just a mean to the ends for the robots in this situation, whereas a lesser movie, I feel like, would just go full Skynet with it, maybe, and just go, the robots are taking over this planet, and the humans are going to get killed off. This is where they stay. I think it's a much more contemplative ending that's left open-ended that leads for some really interesting discussion.
I agree. Yeah, I really liked the movie, and I liked it more after watching your syllabus that you drafted, or what I was able to make time to watch, and then rewatching the movie. And especially Ghost in the Shell, and I'm sure you can tell because that's the one that I keep bringing up.
Yep.
Because it examines those same things about what makes a human, its identity, and we didn't even bring up June's double, right?
No, the double,
like, that's something to talk about too, especially visually, because she gets, her face cut in half, which is, she gets her face cut in half, is deactivated. June dies. She gets just completely
just in the
shot
club
in the head. Just boom, dead, done, very sudden, very, there's no buildup. It just kind of happened. Well,
and this is
not no buildup,
around the point in the movie where they realized that she was mining her brain out to Royjacker for this project, which I guess we completely skipped over. We can kind of rewind a little bit if we want to talk about that. Like, the whole data mine / heist thing into the police station thing is also just another, really interesting thing. Some really fun imagery with the split June robot, as you were saying.
Yep.
It's there's so much in this movie. It crams a lot into an hour and a half. It's really impressive because no scene feels like fluff.
Oh, yeah, that's something I wanted to mention up front. I think it clocks 89 minutes, right?
Yes. Yep.
I was flabbergasted at the level of storytelling, how much it was able to get in such a short period of time, because most movies like this, especially if they're not going to theaters, they can be 2.5 hours long. They can be 2 hours long, 3 hours long. This one was like, nope, we're doing it in 89 minutes. It wrote a very clean, effective script, and I don't think anything was really wasted.
It's very economic storytelling. Like, it doesn't miss a beat. It just gives you everything you need to know, and it gives you, the personal moments, so you can grow with your characters and care about them, but it doesn't overstay its welcome in any way. Like, it's pretty perfect in as far as pacing goes.
Yeah. We haven't talked about a lot of stuff.
No, I mean, there's a whole sequence where they get captured and she's in jail, and Like she's trying to convince them this whole thing, and you kind of get the idea that Roy Jacker probably owns the police in this scenario, so it doesn't really matter. I mean, a lot of it seems like they have a lot of androids on site there anyway. Like there's so much to get into, so still it's such a compact movie.
It is. I agree. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe we have another conversation about this at a later time. Maybe we bring some other people on to talk about it or something.
For sure.
I don't want to, press my luck with how much time we have here, because I know you were planning on like an hour to an hour and a half. But is there anything that you like really want to touch on that we haven't yet? Like whether it's the visual aspect of June's double being her having literally two faces, or any of the other elements. There's the scene with Carlos toward the end where he shoots Roy Jacker and then he cries and he can't can't stop himself from crying.
Yeah, I'm cool with
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I mean, just like you were saying, just the human instinct that he feels still, even though he's pretty much at the end of his line and connecting with his humanity at this point in the movie. It's really, really effective. Like it's kind of tough to watch. Like you're starting to feel for the robots more and more. You get that scene in the jail where they show the deactivation process of robot, where they like push it in that tube and it like implodes and it just looks painful. And it's an object. It's a piece of metal at this point because it's getting shut down. But it looks painful. Like the imagery in this movie is just, it's so strong.
Yeah, and the pleading that it does the whole time.
Yeah.
Because this is after the point where the Emancipation Protocol has initiated.
Right at it.
And it just wakes up. It's completely confused. It has no idea why they're trying to destroy it or what's going on. And so, they're pleading, or it's pleading with them to, help me out of here. Why are you doing this to me? And then it just gets shredded. And that's a very intense moment. It's a very intense moment.
Very effective.
It's like, it's like Decker gunning down a replicant in the middle of the street, right? Is it murder? Is it not murder? Like, as an audience member, yeah, it absolutely is. But in the context of the morality of the film, it isn't, which is why it's horrifying.
Yeah.
Right? It should be, but this is a human society that's now gotten to a point where this is not. And that's what horrifying is. It's warning us off of, coming to a point where that's the case.
For sure. It's made so much more effective by being right after that jailbreak too, because this robot more or less thinks it's human. So it, like you're saying, it's just pleading for its life. It very much feels like it is human at this point. And it just, all this stuff at the last 30 minutes, which it's crazy that all of that happens in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Just really hammers home the themes of that sense of identity and like the humanity and all that.
Yeah, and that we didn't touch on like the organic tank or
right.
Like there's so much stuff that we could touch on.
Right. The whole organic. They mentioned, I think the organics are supposed to like take over the military. That like that's the goal is to. Is that a line they mentioned at one point, or am I misremembering that?
There's a conversation between Beryl and I'm never going to remember her name, the main character.
Yeah.
If you want to tell me again, go ahead. But if you're lost in your notes, that's fine.
Aileen.
Okay. So there's a conversation between Beryl and Aileen where, what's that monstrosity? Oh, it's a tank. And he wants it to occupy the military. But then there's this sort of, this mention that are any buyers lined up, I think is the line.
Yeah.
And Beryl says, well, we're struggling, but don't say that to the investors.
Right.
So that's the plan. But if that's, I didn't dwell too much on that, but I'm sure that says much to the idea of adopting the organics, how it's going. So the robots are probably really leaving them in a bad way.
Yeah.
Right?
It also says a lot about Roy Jacker as a character who we haven't touched on a ton yet. When Aileen is talking to him in his office, they have a deliberate shot of a picture of him in military outfit with Aileen, you assume, from years past. So it seems like this might be more of a personal project for him and kind of maybe, I don't know, explaining some of his motivation towards moving towards the organics besides just corporate profit. Like it kind of humanizes him in a way they don't touch on too heavily, and I might be overreaching with that, but I don't know. Roy Jacker is an interesting character in and of himself that we haven't touched on too much.
Roy Jacker is an interesting character. I think the relationship between Roy Jacker and Carlos and Aline are it's very interesting. We don't know that they were all a part of the same unit until or I don't know if it's the midpoint, maybe it's a little past the midpoint where Aline goes to his office for the first time.
I want to say it's pretty early in almost, right? Like it's, I mean,
Maybe
again, it is such a short movie. So, 30 minutes into the movie is a third of the way through.
Yeah. But she goes to his office, Roy Jacker's office, and there he keeps a picture of Carlos alive with Aline and himself dressed in their military uniforms.
Uniforms,
what I meant. And that's, that's another thing that we can discuss, right? So Carlos was the only member of their group to actually die there.
Mm-hmm.
And then he ends up being the only surviving member based on manufactured memories that aren't really his because he's a robot. There's a lot there, right?
Yeah.
It would probably take some time to unpack that.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting just watching the other characters grapple with that because, like you said, he has that picture of him alive. Aline's contact picture for him is him alive. There's a lot there for sure.
Yeah, and that the commentary about you're not actually alive. Well, I can't remember what exactly the lines were, but it was like, you're not alive. I am alive.
I am alive. No, you're not. And then there's another scene like right as she's starting to sober up, probably around the half-hour mark in the movie, where I can't remember the line. I wish I'd written it down, where she mentioned something like, "You're the only friend I have left, at least human friend," because then she starts talking about Beryl.
Yes. But yeah, because Beryl too, but she's a robot, and then
right,
and this is from behind, and then when she says, "But Beryl's a robot," it swings around to the front, and she's realized what she's just done, and you can see the expression on her face. Yeah, there's a lot here. A lot of it can be dived into. Some of it is just sort of the way in which the story's told. Right. Yep. So there's not really much more to it. There's nothing deep. It's not that it's a part of the commentary. It's just that it's really effective storytelling.
Yeah.
It uses the visual medium to great effect.
Yeah. It's very dense too. Like you were saying, there's so much more to dive into. It's just easy to skip around. It feels like
it is. It's one of those films where like you kind of have to almost even to watch this conversation. It's like, you have to have seen the movie.
Yeah.
So that you have that frame of reference. Otherwise, it's going to seem like a scatterbrained conversation because what the hell are we even talking about at this point?
I am curious. Did you watch the subtitled version the second time? I know you mentioned that you watched the dub the first time.
I did not watch the subtitled version the second time, but and I know this is not the same. I did watch subtitled in English.
Okay.
So I did have the subtitles on. I just didn't watch the French version.
Mm-hmm.
Did you?
I did. I watched both. It's one of those ones where I feel like a lot of times a dub feels like an afterthought. Like a lot of times it seems like, American distributor picks up this movie. We're going to do a dub to sell it to U.S. audiences. It doesn't really in this movie. I kind of got the same thing from both versions. It felt like they were made kind of in, tandem with each other. Not too much difference in the screenplays, little lines here or there that might have been lost in translation. But the dub is really solidly handled. I thought the voice acting was really good. Josh Keaton as Carlos is really, really good. I thought he does a great job portraying that character.
I agree. I liked the dub quite a bit. Mm-hmm. I thought that it was just very well done, right? And this is without having any frame of reference for the sub, but I enjoyed the dub. It was there are bad dubs out there that you are bad. This is not
for sure. I mean, Princess Mononoke's dub is like famous. They might have even redone it at some point because it was so kind of despised that it's on its release. Just really interesting movie. Really enjoyed it. Very excited to see what that director does next. I think he's very interesting.
What else has he done previous to this?
So he has a mini series that people really into, and I wish I would have looked it up beforehand because I can't remember the name of it, but I think it's 2 seasons and it's not easy to find. I'll have to look it up at some point. I wish I would have looked it up before the conversation. But this is his
you can always text me
feature. Yeah, for sure. This is only his second feature, and he says he has more planned in the sci-fi world. I think he said his next thing is a psychological thriller. Like, it's really, I'm really looking forward to it. It's, I don't know, animation done in such a grounded adult manner isn't super common. It's always interesting to see when it's done well.
Okay. I am very interested for sure. I mean, if he's going to produce more stuff like this in the same vein, like compact and you know, visually striking and poignant, I'm all there for it. Oh, this is funny. This is from the home of dubs, Dublin. Silly puns. I love them.
They're the best.
So I think we're at a good point to wrap it up, even though we haven't discussed everything in the film.
For sure.
I think we've discussed enough to get the main themes out there, I think, to show how effective it is at achieving them. I think we've gotten the main message of the film out there with, you know, as far as identity and the warning of humanity against continuing down a particular path, which is typical of Cyberpunk, but it's also very unique voice in the way that it states its message. And, you know, maybe there's more to it. Maybe we decide at a later date that we want to come back to this, or maybe we do, I don't know, man, maybe we just do a rundown of Cyberpunk movies and, you know, to go over this one again.
That's fun. That's always fun too. Just, I mean, because we barely touched on ALPHAVILLE or Blade Runner. Like, there's so much left on the bone to talk about with this genre.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like it might benefit the discussion to be like, okay, well, here's the Ghost in the Shell discussion, here's the Blade Runner discussion, here's the ALPHAVILLE discussion. Even though there's not really a ton to say about ALPHAVILLE, we could front load that.
It's more the proto mold, like the jumping off point for everything else in the genre. I think. Yeah. The movie does what it does relatively effectively, right? It's just, it's more interesting what spawned from it than the movie itself, I feel like, at least.
Yeah. Yes. It sort of, it planted a seed, and, you know, seeds are small and boring little things. But boring was a bad word, but you know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah,
it's not as complex. So, you know, I would love, if you thought this went well and you'd like to come back, I'd love to have you back for more conversations. Jax, who I have on regularly, made sure to let me know that they want to be included in the Rashomon discussion. I love Rashomon. It's my favorite Kurosawa film. I would like for you to participate in that, I think, if you're interested.
For sure.
And then there's the Green Knight, which will be with because that was an episode that is now lost to the internet. I'm sure I did something wrong, but it's not viewable.
Yeah.
So we're going to just redo it, but I'm going to try to have Doug and I was going to say Sable Phoenix. He is now the Titter Pig Rancher on YouTube. But I'd like for you to be involved in that conversation, because the only reason I watched that movie was because you encouraged me to watch it. It's a very, very interesting movie. It, again, has a lot to say. And I'd like to sort of include you in that conversation. So if you're game.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite movies of the decade, so I would totally be down to talk to that one.
Okay, cool. And then if there are any other films that you'd like to just, you know, have an opinion on and get it out there into the ether of the internet, you know, I'm happy to lend my platform to that. Just tell me what to watch. I'll watch it. We can talk about it.
I'm very interested to see how the new Nosferatu turns out. You know, I'd love to maybe have a conversation on that one, maybe delve into the other, like a couple of the other adaptations of it, maybe some of Robert Eggers' other work. I'd definitely be interested in coming on and talking about that one if it's one you'd be interested in talking about.
Yeah, in fact, like, do you want to maybe have a series, and we can sort of have an episode about the other renditions of Nosferatu, because I think we could talk for a little, and definitely an hour, right? Hour and a half about those. So we'll talk about Nosferatu, and then we can come back in December after we've seen the film and actually just devote an episode to that and reference the other one.
For sure.
Cool. Well, I'll put that on the schedule then. That sounds awesome.
Awesome.
All right, Blaze, thanks for hanging out. Chat, thank you for hanging out. I appreciate it. And I was going to end, but I'm going to click end, and it's going to hang on for a minute. So it's going to, you know, my dumb face is going to be up there for longer than it should be. But there we go.